Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Idea Roastery. I'm Jason.
And I'm Herman.
Herman, we've spoken about open source a couple of episodes ago. There's another drama unfolding online. I know you're not on social media, but I think you and your sort of Warren somewhere has received news about what's happening with WordPress. And so today I wanted to just talk about it, not specifically the WordPress because we're not lawyers, but more generally the impact that it might have on open source, which you're also involved in because you have a little open source project. So I'll start with the question: what's your licensing on Bear right now?
So currently Bear has a MIT license, which is pretty much you're free to do whatever you want with the license. And I think that that's generally the go-to license for free and open source software. You make the distinction of free as in beer or free as in freedom, and this is more towards the free as in freedom. But I think DHH, the Rails creator, put it the best in that open source projects tend to, by and large, be run by benevolent dictators for life. And so this is also tangential to what's been happening with WordPress, which, holy shit.
So WordPress is a very popular framework used to build websites on the internet. So a framework is basically, I guess it's like a bunch of utilities that you use that makes it easier to build websites. Like, so it includes some tooling around like how you show like the views of a page, and there's got some database connectivity things because there's a lot of different components that go into building websites. So WordPress is basically all of that in a sort of bundle that you can just install. And the reason why it's so popular is it's got this really wild plugin system, and it's been used for, I guess, when did it come out? In like 2003?
To like 21 years ago, something like that. It also runs the majority of the internet. Out of every different programming language framework, WordPress runs, I think it's between 40 and 50% of the internet, but don't quote me on that.
Yeah, well, that's what they say, and the rest is all scrubs like me trying to build JavaScript stuff.
Yeah.
And not doing successfully. And I think the reason why it's been successful is it's fairly simple. It's kind of almost like a standardization around PHP, which is the programming language that it uses. And it's used very commonly as like a blogging platform. And because it's so ubiquitous, there's obviously a challenge where it comes to hosting this wonderful piece of technology. And I think that's where this WordPress engine debacle comes in, right? So we've got first of all, WordPress has always been open source. Open as in do what you want with it kind of thing. I think the license was GPL, but what happened is it's basically given out for free. Then there were companies like WordPress Engine and others who started hosting the framework and charging a fee.
Just to clarify over there, so you've got this free piece of software that you can host yourself. So you can have a little VPS or a server somewhere, and you can install it on the server, and then other people can visit your website. But most people don't want to manage their own servers. And so a bunch of different companies, including a private company that is owned by the main person behind WordPress, started up that hosted WordPress for you. So you would go onto WP Engine or WordPress.com, which is the for-profit entity, as opposed to WordPress.org, which is the open source foundation. And so you would go there and you would pay, $5-6 a month, and they would host your site for you. And all you needed to do is, just sign up, and it would spin up an instance.
Yeah, exactly. And now the challenge, the dilemma that's come about in recent weeks is that the original creator of WordPress, Matt Mullenweg, has basically engaged in like a sort of legal dispute with WordPress Engine, who is, I believe, owned by private equity companies. That's, I think, what the narrative is at the moment. And so WordPress Engine is basically making a lot of money. And from the outside, it seems that Matt's just feels like they deserve a bit of that money because of the way in which WordPress profits from the fact that the open source solution is
WP
there.
Engine.
Yeah. Yep. So which I think the reason why it's caused such controversy is because of the there's a difference between ethics and like business when it comes to open source, right? Because when you open source something, and I think the main narrative is that like if you open source it and you allow people to do this, and that was the sort of license at the time, you shouldn't be able to come and claw back like these claims.
It's kind of like giving out free lemonade. You've got like a free lemonade stand, and like this is the thing that you see in the world. You know, there's a free lemonade stand, and so they're like, "Hey, you want some free lemonade?" And you're like, "Yeah, I'd love some free lemonade." And then you drink the lemonade, and then they're like, "Oh, you should leave a tip." And you're like,
Mm,
"That wasn't the agreement that I came to." Like, I don't think I
yeah,
would have drank your lemonade if I had known that you would have expected something
yeah.
from me afterwards.
Exactly. It's also it's almost like if you throw out something like a you throw out like a piece of furniture, someone collects that furniture and then goes and sells it for like $1 million. You can't go and say, well, like I deserve a bit of that $1 million because it was my thing originally. No, no, no. You left it out there. I'm not saying that open source is leaving stuff on the sidewalk, but it's essentially like it's like another claim that's come in later on.
Mm.
And I guess the reason why it's now a problem for creators or people who are building is first of all like because WordPress is so ingrained into the internet. So many people have like built businesses around WordPress. That like a lot of I mean, I think even myself, like some of the first projects I built for customers was on WordPress. There's agencies, there's obviously hosting providers. I know like basically everywhere there is internet, there's some sort of hosting of a WordPress site that's available as a service. And this is now almost making people like worry because now like if I've got a website that's running on WordPress, are they going to come after me? Are they going to come after this person? And I think that's where the dilemma is coming from is like, do we now not trust it could because if this goes through and this becomes a legal thing and Automatic wins, then that means that like you can't have any open source because that sets a precedent that other companies would now do the same thing, right?
Yeah, it's actually like one of a few blows that have happened to open source over the past couple of years. The main problem with open source I see is around compensation of maintainers, and this is kind of what the root of the problem or the root of the antagonism that started between Automatic, Matt Mullenweg, and WP Engine is that uh, Automatic does a lot of development on the core WordPress open source software, as well as runs a for-profit business that sells hosting for it. And WP Engine has contributed, but very, very, very little to the actual core. They just use it and resell it. And it kind of makes sense considering they are owned by private equity and they have very clear, business objectives. And it turns out that contributing to open source is really like charitable giving when it comes down to it. So the whole fiasco started when uh, Automatic sent a letter to WP Engine essentially demanding an 8% royalty on its use of WordPress. And this then spiraled into trademark infringement, which previously in the terms of service, um, it was stated that you were allowed to use the term WP um, but then it was later changed to say you shouldn't use the term WP because it could be confused for WordPress us. And then they explicitly call out WP Engine and say like those fuckers at WP Engine
Yeah.
are doing, and they're confusing people and bippity boppity boo. But keep in mind that like these are millionaires, maybe even billionaires that are
Mm,
kind of duking it out, and it's all of us, us plebs who are getting caught in the crossfire. I know that WordPress has turned off access to the plugins platform
mm,
for WP Engine, and in so doing, everyone who's hosted on WP Engine can't update their plugins, which leads to security vulnerabilities and a lot of problems in the future.
mm,
And those, like these are, you know, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of clients at WP Engine are now being affected by Matt trying to,
Mm.
you know, make a point. Like he's already rich.
Yeah. So there's two topics that we can like kind of dig deeper into. The first one is this idea of like giving back enough. I think so. That was one of the claims that he said why they're in this dispute is because WP Engine isn't giving back enough, right? So are there any ways you could have an incentive to give back? Because I guess this is like the crux of it is like when it's open source, you have one team that's usually contributing the most. Well, there's always someone who's like contributing the most to a project, and then you've got all the like the chum feeders, I guess you could call them, or all the people who are basically just using the project. And anytime there's like an update, there's like a security update, then you just wait for the sort of open source developers to fix it, and then you just bring it into your project. So you're getting free development you're getting development for free, and you're just benefiting from the most of it. So does it and I know for some people who are not in the dev world, it feels like this is not a business model. Like, why would you ever give it away for free, right? Is there such thing as like giving back enough, or is there any models that you've seen or
Hmm.
heard of ways where there is a way to give back more, right?
Yeah. So I know that the creator of Alpine Linux, Alpine JS, which is a minimal JavaScript reactive framework, has a fairly novel way of being compensated for his work, and that is that um, he runs a completely free and open source library that is extensively used, but he gives priority support to people who contribute to the project, as well as a couple of other benefits, early releases, email, like you can get in touch with him via email and stuff like
Mm,
that. And that seems to have worked out very well for him as an individual creator. But now keep in mind that Alpine JS is very small compared to something like WordPress or something like, you know,
mm,
Linux, right?
mm,
Um, so there are some initiatives like the Giving Pledge where companies pledge to give, I think it's 1% of their revenue, pre-tax revenue, to open source projects in the form of a contribution, specifically the open source projects that they use, or at least that make up the main part of their software stack. And
mm,
after following this drama, I've actually decided that Bear is going to sign the Giving Pledge and contribute back to the Django Foundation, as well as one or two libraries that we use fairly extensively that I would be very remiss without.
mm.
Um, but
Newsflash, same.
but to be entirely honest, I think that the problem with open source more generally is is a fundamental mismatch between how the internet was and how the internet is. Because back in the day
Mm,
when open source was created, it was just a bunch of us nerds like trying to make the internet something cool. And everyone was just keen to work on these things. And those are still the same people who are open source maintainers today,
mm,
where now the internet is full of business interests. And again, business interests are not interested in doing charity. They're interested in
yeah.
maximizing revenue. And so there have been a bunch of different talks around different kinds of licenses where it essentially retains a lot of the features of free and open source, except for if you are a revenue generating business in excess of X million dollars per annum,
Mm,
and then you need to pay for a license, which does make it more complicated. However, and there's also, it's difficult to police, but if you've created a fancy piece of software and you have a license like that, every now and then you can just do a little scan of a bunch of bigger companies, see if they're using your software and send them an invoice. And like
mm.
I think that's a reasonable way to make free software for people, but it does muddy the water of
Yeah.
what the pureness of open source is.
Yeah. I think so one model that comes to mind is Tailwind, right? Where so they've got a free so Tailwind like CSS kind of tool for JavaScript. They've got like a free offering, but it's like very basic. And then in order to use all of their components and all of the capabilities, they have like a pro feature which you pay once off. And then I guess later down the line, their idea is that they'll go to you, see that you're using Tailwind, and then they'll basically say, well, where's your license? And if you've got a license, then it's good. But if you don't have a license, then they'll say, okay, we'll just buy a license, right? And I think it kind of, I don't know whether that's a good model, because there's also the part of like some projects just scale better because they're open source, right? So the other side of it is projects like Kubernetes. I think when I was working at Amazon, there was always like a thing about Kubernetes was built in by Google. They open sourced it, and maybe that was like the biggest mistake they'd ever made, because like it became so prevalent, and if they just kept it, it would have become like a standard. But the thing is, it doesn't become a standard unless it's open source, right? So the reason why WordPress has become so like prolific is because of its open nature, right? So there's kind of like open source being used as like a business model to scale your project. Like another example is like MongoDB, also open source, but now we're seeing a lot with these projects that they're now switching to kind of more restrictive models. It happened with HashiCorp Terraform. Now there's an open tofu. Redis has also got like a val key, which is another project. But I think the difference with these ones is that, and maybe this is also coming down to the business aspect, is that there's like an efficiency challenge, right? Because when I think about the problem that's happening with Matt and WordPress, is that this is not something that you do when things are going well, right? I think if you're making enough money, and maybe that's just our opinions of people who don't have like tons of cash, right? You're making enough cash, right? If you're profitable, like you're doing well. And this is why DHH is also cool, because he's like made enough and he's like having fun. Like you don't make these kind of like claims if you're doing well. And maybe that's the indicative thing, is that like these projects are becoming more closed source because they're not like making as much money, because it's just easier to host it on AWS or host it somewhere else, or there are tools that are making it easier to provide that same ecosystem somewhere else. And I think the other part is that the efficiency of those projects, if Automatic's offering was really the best offering, would there even be a WP engine? So there's almost like an efficiency problem of like, why are people going to WP if Automatic or WordPress.com is so good? And maybe there's either a price point that they're not managing to hit. There's maybe like, maybe it's just they're better at marketing. But that's also something that I think about, is like, why are they not doing well? Because they were the first ones to offer the product as like a hosted service. They obviously own the development pipeline. They're close to their customers, I hope. And so why is there even a competitor if they're so far ahead?
I think what scares me the most about this specific situation is the precedent that it sets. So let's take, for instance, a couple of uh, bigly used, very much used pieces of software, something like React, right? Now, React is pretty much entirely developed by Meta. I mean, yes, there's contributors all over the globe now, but Meta, by and large, makes up pretty much all the development hours that go into improving and maintaining React. Now, React runs a big chunk of the internet. Yes, it's not as much as WordPress, but it still is a really large chunk of modern websites that run React. And theoretically, if Meta were to act in the same way as specifically Matt Mullenweg or Automatic in general, that would be a terrible, terrible thing, right? Um, I think that hits closer to home for me because I have used React more recently than I've used WordPress. Like I haven't used WordPress in a good
Yeah.
10 years, maybe longer. Um, but I don't like the precedent it sets because it kind of says, hey, this is free and open source. Oh no.
Yeah, I think for like a lot of people, they're kind of like treading. They feel like they're treading on like sort of uneven ground, because it's like you don't know when one of these projects is going to suddenly switch. I guess so. Like talking about the Terraform one, that was the sort of more recent one that kind of sticks in memory. Like Terraform changed to being like less permissive. But if you looked at it, it was only really like using Terraform to create a competitor to HashiCorp Cloud, right? And that's what was happening in that ecosystem too. There was like companies that were going out like competing against HashiCorp. But then again, I'm still like, well, they had Terraform, they had the platform. Like, why were they not able to innovate? And maybe that's just part of like innovation, right? You get smaller players who are able to be more agile, and they just win out because they're able to sort of cater to the needs of their customers better. And I think if uh, HashiCorp was able to do that, then there would be no real competition, right? Because they've got the tech first. Um, but yeah, like I think it
Hmm.
makes
Hmm.
people nervous, and maybe trying to switch it back to like a positive. I think there are more of these like sort of foundations being created, like the Linux Foundation, the CNCF Foundation, Django. I think is part of also a foundation, and maybe that is kind of the way out. Is that you have to just use software that's from a foundation, right? Because hopefully with it,
That has a good governance system and isn't a benevolent dictator for life.
yeah, I mean, unless they take like OpenAI's sort of playbook and then switch to like for profit or however they did that. But like yeah, like you have like a foundation
Mm.
because the non-profit sort of legal system is basically that they want to have some sort of benefit. And so you just got to kind of know like, okay, well, they've got the benefit, they've got the non-profit, and so maybe that's the software I'll use. But then there's like, like Python is like kind of this. I don't know if they have a fund. I do think actually they do have the PSF as the foundation there, but some of the technologies that I'm using, don't aren't part of those, or
So what do you think are some potential solutions to this problem? Like we're not going to solve open source over here, but I'm curious to see what you think.
so the one thing that came up uh recently that I was researching is this is more in the security sense. And I think this is also like a valid point, right? Because where we do see people contributing upstream to projects like with Kubernetes is when there's security issues, right? So all of the major cloud providers have Kubernetes offerings, and if there's a security issue, they have to contribute back. And there's this idea of software chain of custody, not chain of custody, software supply chain, basically. So you've got this idea of like a piece of software, then you look at all the dependencies and you say, well, are these at risk? What are the dependencies of these ones? Who are the people that are like owning these projects? And it kind of this in the same sense, they're doing that for security. I think it was because there was like some vulnerability found in like a very common like JavaScript package. And so in the same sense, I think they're just going to add like licensing as a sort of feature of this sort of supply chain, so that you can kind of say, well, these projects are potential risks. Then if you have that supply chain, maybe you could have, I mean, an ideal situation would be having an attribution system where I know GitHub has like a donate button, that kind of thing, where you could kind of do it. All the other side is just like you got to have a paid for model, right? Where you like, well, pay me something. I built this product. If you
Mm.
use it, you have to, buy, like maybe buy up front is the way that you have to go, because then at least the transactions happen. You've made your money, use it as well. But it's difficult.
Yeah. I've come to appreciate the way that Unreal Engine uh, charges. I forget the exact details, but it essentially says, "Hey, listen, this is free until you're making
Mm,
buck, like until you're making like good money." Um, but I think the difference with that specifically is that that's when your entire your entire company essentially runs through that engine. Whereas what can happen with, let's take for instance, if you start a new project today and you're using Next.js and npm and your node modules folder is full to bursting, you've probably imported and used hundreds of open source libraries. Um, and if you want to give back or whatever, you'd be sending money to 100 different people in various quantities, or if each of them had um, their own monetization strategy, that would also
mm,
like cripple you as a software developer. So in a sense, the only real way that modern software can work is if we have free and open source software that just kind of runs on the backs of people putting in free time. But I actually think having like some sort of open source contribution pool would be an interesting thing where companies are incentivized and even governments are incentivized to put money into this big
mm,
pool that is then through some mechanism distributed. So let's take, for instance, you like a mega foundation where that foundation's purpose is to go and dump money into open source projects based on, let's say for instance they do a scrape of projects and they see the utility of a certain project. So like this specific library is used
Mm,
by a whole bunch of people, especially a whole bunch of their sponsors. Well,
mm.
they get a portion of that. But no one likes
Yeah.
optimizing for giving money away. So like,
And it also, I think it would also require quite a large degree of being plugged into what everyone's building.
Mhm.
Because like the thing is with open source is if it's behind the scenes, like, and it's not like visible, you don't really know what these companies are using behind the scenes, right? So to have that scrutiny into a business and say, well, what software is a business using? But maybe, yeah, I think I like the idea of almost like open source being like part of a government pool, or I think just software in general. Like surely in every country there is some sort of entity that's looking out for the security of the nation, and in that sense they should also be looking at, you know, is the software that the government is using secure? Because yeah, like the reason why open source is good is because why reinvent the wheel if you've got like a tool that works quite well, right? And it's just about attribution and
Mhm.
yeah, I guess like
The,
finding a way to give value back to those contributors, or to just build it from scratch, which I think some country, like I know South Africa does a lot of that shit where they like build stuff from scratch, but maybe that's the way you should be doing it. Is like maybe we've lost that ability to build some of these libraries, and yeah, it's quicker to use a framework, but like I think in the sense of Bear blog is like you were saying, like yeah, people just forgot how to use HTML and CSS, and so that's why you have WordPress.
mm. No, absolutely.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I've done quite extensively over the past years, I've tried to minimize the dependencies on Bear. So if a library can reasonably be written fairly easily, I'll just write my own version of it. Like let's take for instance, it's something that breaks down the structure of a top level domain. So you can extract the subdomain and the TLD and stuff like that. Like I can do that
Mm.
myself. Might as well spin it myself. But
Yeah.
I'm not going to go and rewrite Django. Like that's big
Yeah.
boy stuff. But just as another note, isn't it strange to think that there are pretty much all multi-billion dollar companies today have critical infrastructure that relies on something that some dude is thanklessly maintaining in his basement for no pay. Uh,
Yeah.
and like that's the crux of it. That's the fundamental problem. And you've actually seen a few of these people become jaded where they're
Mm.
not getting paid for this, and then people will come and like put up issues and be like, "Hey, my company needs you to do XYZ." And there have been a couple of cases where they've just been like, "Well, fuck you all," and like exploited them or just destroyed all
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
those systems. Um,
Yeah. There was a what was it? Left pad or something.
yeah, yeah.
One of those issues. But yeah, I thought about that the other day. I was like, well, what happens when Linus like sort of
Like
moves
when he
on
when he
or
finally
becomes too
cracks.
old to? Yeah. I mean, he's already quite a wiry character from
Yeah.
what things I've seen on the internet. But like, what happens when he's too old to like see a screen and like write stuff? Does Linux just not get updated? I mean, I guess there's enough like Ubuntu, like all these kind of companies that are invested in kernel upgrades. But I guess you do have this idea of like handover, like
Yeah.
because we're getting to a point where there are like people who are like the old, like James Goslings, all of these kind of people who created all the software are going to move on, and there needs to be like a succession plan, right? Where
Hmm.
like someone else is going to take the reins. I know with Guido and Python, there was like now that the Python Foundation is kind of operating in this kind of like decentralized world, and it kind of works, I guess. Which maybe is a indication that it can happen, but you can also have that go wrong, right? Where like there's no one in charge anymore, and
Yeah, when it comes down
things fuck up.
to stability and confidence, um, it actually makes sense to turn it into a bureaucracy. I'm not a fan of bureaucracies because they're slow and they are shit. But
Yeah.
it is better than having everything rely on one person, like not waking up from bed one day and being
Mm.
like, fuck it.
Yeah, maybe it's also like may- maybe you just go proprietary. You just like, well, I only use proprietary stuff because I know I've paid for it. I know what I'm getting, and if proprietary with you need to have it like not locked in too much, right?
Yeah.
But like you just say, well, if someone's gonna come after me, they're gonna come after like WP Engine, right? Rather than my little
Yeah.
like
Yeah,
project.
actually you can reasonably build anything you need to build, in like pure Microsoft tooling,
Mm,
right? And like you're buying into a
mm.
specific thing. But yeah, that is entirely
I
possible.
guess yeah. So like the way that Amazon did it is like they would always have this customer focus and like they always reduce prices. And I think it's almost that trend that was like it was bucking a trend, right? Because people always worry like I'm going to use a tool and then they're going to rank up the prices like they did with Maps and like they did with a couple of other Google products. But I think Amazon was always like, well, we're going to get better efficiency, we're going to get better economies of scale, and so that should bring prices down. And I think maybe that's just why people are worried is because when there's a lock in or when there's like a problem where you have too much control of your system, people are worried that people are going to just pull up the prices. So maybe there needs to be almost like a ruling that you can't like
Regulation around
regulation
that,
around
yeah. It's
pricing. You
kind
can't
of
just
kind of like rent control, but for
yeah,
software.
rent control for software. Because I think if people were like, oh well, they can't just like raise the price like 20x on my project, then people will be like, well, that's a little bit safer, and maybe I will use proprietary better because then
Mm.
I'm protected from
I
that.
I actually logged on to Replit 2 days ago and realized that everything that I was hosting on there has been shut down because they changed their
Yeah,
plans. And
Heroku did the
uh,
same.
the free plans that, yeah, the free plans that I was using just are removed. And I did receive some emails from them, but I didn't actually read the
Mm.
emails. I was just like, okay, yeah, they've got some new pricing things. Please don't send me your marketing information. And I didn't realize what they were actually saying was, Herman, we're gonna trash your shit.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, Heroku had the same, and there were a couple of like open. Was it? There's like Neon, and then there's one that's for like MySQL, which is like like a scalable database thing. I think it was like Cloudless name goes by, but basically they were offering like a free like hobbyist tier, and then obviously they got rid of that because I think my thing is that whenever you're getting something for free, you just need to be a little bit skeptical because there's still a server there somewhere. Like it doesn't matter, and there's still someone running that server. So it's not like economically, it's not free to run it. And
Mm.
so same with like Cloudflare, there's a lot of free stuff, all free like DDoS protection and all that kind of stuff. But I'm always like, well, for how long and what's the limitation of that? Because we have seen providers like start to like remove their free tier because of fraud is a big one because a lot of people use them for like nefarious things.
Bad things.
But also like, people are worried like, oh well, how long is it going to be free for? You just got to be a bit skeptical, I
Yeah.
think.
No, no, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Well, on a positive note, just to end off over here, is that while it is messy and complicated and there are niche problems that do need to be solved, by and large, open source does work. And I think we can kind of look at it in the same way that we look at democracy, where,
Mm.
democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the
Mm.
others. And I think open source is the worst form of software development, except for all
Yeah,
the
so
others.
I like that. I like that. It's basically like you don't like when things go like that, but if that's what more than 50% of the people say, that's like democracy, right? So not you're not always liking it. And in the same sense, if you open source something, someone makes a mint out of it, like that you just got to
Yeah,
be okay with that because you could also be the guy who takes open source and makes money out of it. There's an opportunity for both people. But I like that
yeah.
that framing, and
It,
I think it's definitely means like open source is still around, but I think just with a bit more skepticism.
yeah, it's kind of like you, yes, you, anyone who's listening to this, you benefit from open source software.
Yeah, there's a benefit.